There are often spaces in a garden that need to be filled in, but in many cases it seems that there's just not enough time to fit in another crop, or I may be uncertain about timing. When trying to grow a succession of crops, I often find that I'm impatiently waiting for one crop to mature enough to get a reasonable yield before the next crop can go in. As a way of managing this, I've started to sow leafy salad crops to fill in the gaps, as both a harvestable yield and as a form of fast-growing cover crop, and it seems to be working quite well. My inspiration for sowing edible cover crops comes originally from Steve Solomon in his book Gardening When It Counts, where he talks about sowing peas, spinach, and other vegetables as a form of cover crop, which could be harvested or not, depending on the circumstances. We usually think of cover crops as being the types of plants that we would not normally eat. They are grown to protect, develop, and feed the soil, and to benefit the following crops, not to feed us directly. On the other hand, we tend to want to harvest as much as possible out of the crops that we do sow, and to grow them in such a way so as to maximize what we can eat, and then to pull them out as soon as they've stopped being productive so that another crop can go in. It's interesting to rethink a cover crop as something that can be a malleable hybrid between the two, depending on context, timing, and the availability of other things to eat during the same period. So I've begun trying out this type of hybrid approach in a few places, using various forms of broadcast sown salad greens, and have been quite successful this past spring using this method in my family-scale polytunnel garden. There were a number of different empty spaces in this covered garden this past spring. Some of them were gaps between the overwintering crops and the summer crops, and for some I just didn't get the other spring crops sown early enough, and I felt that there wasn't enough time for them to mature. I broadcast sowed 4 different types of leafy salad greens in 10 different patches. There was 4 batches of spinach, 3 batches of rocket or arugula, 2 batches of a mix of spicy brassica greens, and 1 patch of red Russian kale. None of these plants will fix nitrogen, and the potential benefits of reducing erosion or preventing the leaching of nutrients isn't really relevant in this covered garden, assuming of course that my watering isn't too aggressive or excessive. But all of these crops are very fast growing, especially in the sheltered warm climate of the polytunnel, producing lots of tender organic matter for eating or for composting. Hopefully they will keep the soil biology quite active with their root secretions while growing and leave the soil in great condition for the following crop. The 4 batches of spinach that were sown had quite different outcomes. The first and largest batch was sown early enough to avoid the real heat of the start of the summer, and I was able to harvest a lot out of it, first through thinning young plants and then picking individual leaves. And then, 53 days after sowing, I removed plants from the center of the bed to make space for transplanting in the tomato plants, and only removed the remaining plants when they started to produce a seed stalk. This was a really productive crop, producing more than 16 kilograms of spinach, or more than 4 kilograms per square meter of bed. But because I prioritized harvesting, not so much organic matter was produced for the compost. The second batch covered a smaller area, and I focused on thinning this crop quite a bit, pulling out whole younger plants for eating to ensure that the remaining plants had lots of space to grow. This patch produced more than 5 kilograms per square meter before the heat of the summer caused them to bolt. But then I left the plants in the ground for another 2 weeks to produce an abundance of organic matter before they were removed to make space for the climbing beans. This was probably my most successful planting of the spring, with a decent balance between a large harvest and gaining the benefits of a cover crop, with lots of organic matter produced for the compost. The third batch was sown almost a month later, and it struggled in the heat. I didn't thin this batch at all, and I harvested a bit by cutting the carpet of smaller leaves, but then I left it as a flowering cover crop, the same as the second batch. The fourth batch of spinach was also sown quite late and had poor germination to start with, leaving gaps in the bed. I transplanted the courgette and zucchini plants in among the spinach, but in hindsight I should have cleared the remains of the crop earlier or left a larger space for the courgette plants, as they seemed to struggle more than they should have. With the 3 batches of rocket or arugula, I struggled to find a balance between harvesting lots, maximizing the benefits of the cover crop, and prioritizing the plants that were to be transplanted into the same bed. The first batch was broadcast sown reasonably early in the season, and as the plants started to bolt, I cleared spaces to make room for the calabrese and cauliflower plants, and they shared the same area of the garden for another week or so. I wonder if this strategy of overlapping the crops is a useful one. The shade provided by the cover crops probably did help during the hot weather, and these plants did produce a lot of biomass over that period, but the transplants may have become overcrowded. The second batch was sown a few weeks later, and I was able to harvest a lot as well as growing a lot of biomass. I only needed to clear a small section of the bed for 1 squash plant to be transplanted in, and the 2 crops grew side by side for 9 days. It was remarkable how much biomass was produced by the rocket plants in that time, and I tried to keep the abundance of growth from overwhelming the squash plant, but perhaps I could have cleared more of the space for the squash. I should also have cleared the third batch of rocket earlier than I did, to make room for the pepper plants, but I don't really have a lot of other salad crops available at this time, so I've shifted priorities to maximizing yields and leaving the rocket in place for longer. So far, I've harvested 6.3 kilograms, or about 4 kilograms per square meter, from 4 cuttings using the cut and come again method. And it looks like it could produce another cutting, but those pepper plants really do need to get into the ground. I sowed 2 batches of a mix of spicy brassica greens, including mizuna, mibuna, 2 types of mustard leaf, and a few rocket seeds sown in for good measure. The first batch was similar to the first batch of spinach, with half the crop being removed to make way for the tomato transplants, and it was managed in a similar way and had very similar yields of about 4 kilograms per square meter. But I think in this case the spinach crop was better, as it was less disruptive to the soil when the plants were finally removed. The second batch of mixed spicy greens is still going, with 3 kilograms per square meter harvested already, and I still have some time before the bed is needed for a later sowing of courgettes or zucchini. But I have a lot of similar salad crops available from my outside gardens, so I will likely leave this bed to grow on as a flowering cover crop, hopefully attracting lots of pollinators into this covered garden. I think the most interesting batch of broadcast sown greens this spring was a red Russian kale, partially because I haven't grown kale as a salad crop before. The batch was the first one sown, was slower to become established, but lasted longest without bolting. Similar to one of the batches of rocket, I cleared a spot for a squash plant and let the 2 crops grow side by side, but I continued to harvest the kale leaves right up until the remains of the cover crop were removed. One of the reasons why I kept this batch of kale in place for so long, as well as the adjacent batch of rocket, is that they served as an excellent host crop for a population of ladybirds or ladybugs. I hadn't considered the possibility of this beneficial aspect of cover crops before. The ladybird larvae were attracted to the aphids on the kale and rocket leaves, and then the larvae attached to the leaves when they entered their pupating stage and emerged a week or so later as adult ladybirds. Thankfully, the timing of this life cycle more or less matched the timing of the kale and rocket cover crops, but I probably would have removed them a bit earlier to give more space to the squash plants if these beneficial insects were not involved. But now, the polytunnel is full of ladybirds, which will do a great job at keeping the aphid population under control for the rest of the summer. So, growing crops in this way has definite advantages, not least of which is the 66 kilograms of salad leaves that I was able to harvest from these crops, which is a lot, especially considering that even 100 grams of salad leaves is quite a bit. If I don't count the 2 batches of spinach which were sown quite late, the remaining 8 batches produced on average of about 3.75 kilograms per square meter of bed, or about 3/4 of a pound per square foot, which is quite good, especially if you consider that this is just an infill crop. But who knows how much would have been produced if I'd grown crops in a more conventional way in these patches of the polytunnel. And the hybrid cover crop approach allowed a lot more organic matter to be generated for my compost pile or for my hens, although I didn't keep track of the quantities. And I can only imagine that the soil in these beds is now better off than if I had left them empty for that period of time. Some of these crops were also an excellent host to beneficial insects, but they were also host to a growing population of slugs. And thankfully I was able to remove most of these slugs from the polytunnel when I removed the remains of the plants, which ended up being an added treat for my hens. So in a way, these plants were both a host crop and a trap crop. Looking to the future, there is a number of interrelated issues that I'm keen to explore, such as what is the appropriate density of seeds to sow, and is there a difference between sowing in drills or broadcast sowing, and when is it most appropriate to thin the seedlings and by how much? Is it better to pick individual leaves or to use a cut and come again method to harvest the entire bed? And if I notice too many weeds are growing among the seedlings, is it better to just treat the entire bed as a cover crop and to not worry about harvesting anything? Would it be better to dig the plants into the soil or to use a chop and drop method and to let them decompose on the surface a bit before I transplanted or sowed the next crop? Or is it better to wait until the last minute and pull the plants out completely to remove them from the polytunnel? Or is it better to let the 2 crops grow side by side for a while? How do the issues of crop rotation relate to these fast-growing crops, especially with the brassica family plants? And what are the possibilities and issues of using the same approach in the outside gardens or in the autumn or over winter? So far, annual spinach is my favorite crop to grow using this method, as it grows really quickly, is highly productive and high value, it's versatile in the kitchen, and it's easy to freeze any surplus. It's also neutral from a crop rotation standpoint and produces a huge abundance of tender biomass when it flowers. And it's easy to pull out and chop into the soil, and it seems to leave the soil in great condition for the next crop. But I'm keen to follow Steve Solomon's suggestion and to sow regular garden peas, where I can harvest a few pea shoots at the beginning of the season and possibly some pods as well if the crop is in the ground that long. I wonder if I'll ever get to the point where I really prioritize the cover crop aspect of this, rather than seeking to harvest as much as possible. But with so many of my neighbors interested in eating whatever I can grow, I don't think I'm at that capacity yet. I am starting to appreciate the benefits that come with growing certain crops, that just because I sow them, it doesn't mean that I have to harvest as much as I can out of them. And I'm beginning to appreciate more the benefits of always having something growing in the soil, so long as it can be easily removed when the bed is needed. And if I can get something tasty to eat out of it, all the better.